You don't have a license. You were just the guy who mops floors. Hospital hallway, 2 in the morning. David Porter stood outside the ICU door, hands trembling as he gripped a paper cup filled with dried herbs. Inside, Catherine Brooks lay dying. The doctors had given up. Could a man who had already lost everything risk it all again? David Porter mopped the third-floor hallway at Regional Medical Center. The smell of disinfectant had replaced the scent of medication he once knew so well. His hands moved in practiced circles across the linoleum, the rhythm automatic after 5 years of night shifts. A young doctor rushed past, nearly colliding with him. A prescription bottle tumbled from her coat pocket and skittered across the wet floor. David bent down and picked it up. The label faced him as he handed it back. Hydromorphone. 7.5 milligrams. Extended release. The doctor snatched it without looking at him. Be careful. Don't touch the medications. You wouldn't understand what they do anyway. She disappeared around the corner before David could respond. He returned to his mop bucket and continued working. His eyes had scanned that label in less than 2 seconds. Dosage, contraindications, interaction warnings. All of it still lived in his memory, like muscle memory in a pianist's fingers. Nurse Helen walked by carrying a stack of charts. She had worked at Regional Medical for 30 years and remembered things most people preferred to forget. David, you still look at those pill bottles like you're reading love letters from an ex-girlfriend. David managed a small smile as he wrung out the mop. Hard habit to break. Nurse Helen shook her head and continued down the hall. David pushed his cart toward the supply closet. His shift would end in 2 hours. Then he would go home to the studio apartment where Emma waited, and he would make her breakfast before school, and he would pretend that this life was enough. He opened his locker in the staff room. Inside hung his jacket and a small photograph taped to the metal door. Emma, at 7 years old, grinning with 2 missing front teeth. Next to the photo sat a small orange pill bottle with her name on it. Digoxin, 0.125 milligrams. Once daily. For the heart condition that would eventually require surgery they could not afford. Beneath the pill bottle, folded and creased from being handled too many times, lay a pharmacy license with a red stamp across it. Revoked. The edge had torn where he had tried to rip it in half 5 years ago, then stopped himself. He was not sure why he kept it. Maybe as a reminder. Maybe as punishment. His phone buzzed. Emma's name appeared on the screen. Dad, my chest hurts again. I'm scared. David closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the locker door. I'll take care of it, sweetheart. I promise. He ended the call and stared at the crumpled license for another moment before closing the locker. Promises were easy to make. Keeping them required money he did not have. Midnight arrived with the sound of sirens. David was cleaning the emergency wing when the ambulance bay doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney at full speed. A woman lay strapped to it, her dark hair matted with blood, her business suit torn and stained. She was still conscious, but her face had gone pale. Dr. Marcus Reed, head of the ICU, appeared immediately and began barking orders. Blunt force trauma to the head and chest, possible internal bleeding. Get her to Trauma Bay 2. Prep for emergency surgery. Medical staff swarmed around the gurney as they wheeled it past. David stood against the wall with his mop, trying to stay out of the way. He caught a glimpse of the woman's face as they passed. Mid-30s. A Patek Philippe watch on her wrist, now cracked. Blood on her collar. Her eyes were open, confused, searching. Someone dropped a wallet. David picked it up and handed it to a nurse. The ID card inside read, Catherine Brooks, Chief Executive Officer, Brooks Technology Solutions. The trauma team disappeared through the double doors. David returned to mopping the floor where drops of blood had fallen. The hospital settled back into its usual rhythm of beeping monitors and hushed voices. 15 minutes later, Dr. Reed burst back through the doors, his face ashen. "She's going into anaphylactic shock. Her airway is closing. We gave her epinephrine, but she's not responding." Another doctor joined him in the hallway. David recognized him as Dr. Philip Santos, the chief of surgery. "What did you give her before the reaction?" Dr. Santos asked. Dr. Reed rattled off a list of medications: standard trauma protocol, pain management, antibiotics, blood thinners. David stopped mopping. His hands tightened on the handle. He knew that combination. He had seen it before, years ago when he still wore a white coat instead of janitor blues. A patient had nearly died from the same drug interaction, a rare reaction that most doctors never encountered in their entire careers. Dr. Santos shook his head. "We need to intubate and get her on a ventilator. There's nothing else we can do right now. We'll stabilize her and transfer her to County General in the morning. They have better equipment for this." Dr. Reed looked defeated. "She might not make it to morning." The two doctors returned to the trauma bay. David stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed doors. He knew what was happening inside that room. The patient's immune system was attacking itself. Her blood pressure would drop. Her organs would begin to fail. The standard treatments would not work because the problem was not the injury. It was the medication they had given her to help. He thought about Emma sleeping in the staff break room because Rebecca had refused to watch her tonight. He thought about the surgery she needed. He thought about the 5 years he had spent pushing a mop and pretending his knowledge did not matter anymore. Then he thought about the woman dying 20 feet away from him. David set down his mop and walked toward the basement stairs. The hospital basement smelled like mildew and forgotten things. David navigated the dim hallways until he reached the old pharmacy storage room. Nobody came down here anymore. The hospital had built a new pharmacy wing 3 years ago, and this space had been abandoned, left to hold outdated supplies and discontinued medications. David pushed open the heavy door. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the darkness. He pulled the chain on a single overhead bulb. Dust particles swirled in the yellow light. He moved between the shelves, reading labels, searching for specific herbs that most modern hospitals had long since discarded. Hawthorn berry, magnesium sulfate, milk thistle extract, potassium chloride. He found them buried under boxes of expired gauze and outdated IV bags. His hands moved with certainty, measuring amounts by memory, combining them in ratios he had learned from a professor who believed that sometimes the old ways worked when the new ways failed. He emptied the mixture into a paper cup from the water cooler. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something else, something he had not felt in 5 years. Purpose. David climbed back upstairs and walked toward the trauma bay. A security guard stood near the nurse's station, but he was absorbed in his phone. David moved past him and approached the trauma bay doors. Through the window he could see Catherine Brooks on the bed, her body rigid, her skin mottled. Machines beeped in distress. Dr. Reed stood with his back to the door, talking with 2 nurses. David pushed the door open. Everyone turned. Dr. Reed's face shifted from surprise to anger in an instant. "What the hell are you doing in here? Get out." David held up the paper cup. "She's having a systemic reaction to the drug combination you gave her. Histamine surge. Her body can't process it. This will neutralize the response." Dr. Reed stared at him like he had lost his mind. "You're a janitor. How would you possibly know anything about drug interactions?" David met his eyes. 5 years ago, I was the head pharmacist at this hospital. My name is David Porter. You can check the records." The room went silent. One of the nurses, an older woman David recognized, but whose name he could not remember, suddenly straightened. "I remember you. You were fired for administering medication without authorization." Dr. Reed took a step toward David. "So, you're the one. You nearly lost your license completely, didn't you? And now you're back here, trying to play doctor with a patient who's already dying?" Get out before I have security remove you." David did not move. He looked past Dr. Reed to the monitor showing Catherine's vital signs. Her blood pressure was dropping. Her oxygen saturation was at 82% and falling. "If you don't try something different, she'll be dead in an hour. You know it. I know it. This treatment won't fix everything, but it'll buy you time to figure out what will." Dr. Bielpform. Reed's jaw clenched. He looked at the monitors, then back at David. "If I let you do this and she dies, you'll go to prison. If she lives, you'll probably still go to prison. Do you understand that?" David thought about Emma sleeping in the break room. He thought about the years he had spent invisible, scrubbing floors while people died. He thought about the moment 5 years ago when he had broken protocol to save a man's life, and how that single decision had cost him everything he had built. He looked at Dr. Reed and spoke quietly. "If I walk away now, I'm already dead." Dr. Reed studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to the nurses. "Let him try, but this is on me. Officially, he was never in this room." David stepped forward and handed the cup to the nearest nurse. His voice was steady as he gave instructions. 50 milliliters intravenous drip. Slow infusion over 30 minutes. Monitor her vitals every 5 minutes. If her blood pressure drops below 80 systolic, stop immediately. The nurse looked at Dr. Reed, who nodded. She took the cup and prepared the IV line. David stepped back and watched as the solution began to drip into Catherine's vein. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the hiss of the ventilator. 10 minutes passed. Nothing changed. Dr. Reed crossed his arms and shook his head. This was a mistake. David said nothing. He kept his eyes on the monitor, watching the numbers. 15 minutes. Still nothing. 20 minutes. Dr. Reed turned toward the door. Then the heart monitor's rhythm shifted. Catherine's blood pressure ticked upward. Her oxygen saturation climbed from 80 to 85, then to 90. Dr. Reed spun back around. "What's happening?" The nurse checked the readings. "Her vitals are stabilizing. Blood pressure is rising. Oxygen levels are improving." Dr. Reed stared at the monitor in disbelief. David allowed himself one slow breath. Then he turned and walked out of the trauma bay without another word. He made it halfway down the hallway before his legs started shaking. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Behind him, through the window of the trauma bay, he could see the medical team working with renewed energy. Catherine Brooks was still alive. For now, that was enough. David returned to the hallway and picked up his mop. His hands were still trembling. He forced them steady and continued cleaning. Working his way toward the staff break room, where Emma slept on the worn couch. He needed to see her face. He needed to remember why he had stopped taking risks 5 years ago. But before he reached the break room, Dr. Reed appeared in the hallway. His expression was unreadable. "She's stable. For now." David nodded and continued mopping. Dr. Reed did not leave. "That was the most reckless thing I've seen in 20 years of practicing medicine. You could have killed her." David kept his eyes on the floor. "But I didn't." Dr. Reed stepped closer, lowering his voice so the nurses at the station would not hear. "You had your license revoked for doing exactly this kind of thing. Playing hero, breaking protocol. You think because it worked once, it justifies the risk." David finally looked up. "I think a woman is alive who wouldn't be otherwise." Dr. Reed's face hardened. "You don't get to make that call anymore. You're not a pharmacist. You're not part of the medical team. You're a janitor who got lucky." The words landed like a physical blow, but David did not flinch. He had heard worse from Rebecca during the divorce. He had said worse to himself during the long nights when Emma cried from chest pain, and he could do nothing but hold her. Dr. Reed turned to leave, then stopped. "Stay away from my patients. If I see you near the ICU again, I'll have you arrested." He walked away. David stood alone in the empty hallway, gripping the mop handle. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarm beeped and then silenced. The hospital continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the small rebellions happening within its walls. David left the mop and bucket by the wall and walked to the break room. Emma was curled on the couch under his jacket, her small chest rising and falling in steady breaths. He sat on the floor beside her and watched her sleep. Her face was peaceful now, but he knew the pain would return. It always did. His phone buzzed, a text from his supervisor. "Report to my office before your shift ends." David closed his eyes. He had known this was coming. At 6 a.m, he stood in the supervisor's cramped office while the man read from a printed email. The hospital director had been notified of the incident. There would be an investigation. In the meantime, David was suspended without pay, effective immediately. "I'm sorry, David. I know you were trying to help. But you crossed a line." David took his final paycheck and cleaned out his locker. The photo of Emma went into his jacket pocket. The pill bottle went into his other pocket. The revoked pharmacy license stayed taped to the locker door. He did not want it anymore. He woke Emma gently, and they walked to the bus stop in the cold morning air. She leaned against him, half asleep, her small hand wrapped around his. "Are we going home, Dad?" David looked down at her pale face and forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart. We're going home." 3 days passed. David sent out applications to other janitorial services, warehouses, grocery stores, anything that would hire someone with a gap in their resume and a revoked professional license. No one called back. Emma's medication was running low. He counted the pills left in the bottle. 8. Enough for 8 more days. After that, he would need to refill the prescription, which required a doctor's visit they could not afford without insurance. On the 4th day, his phone rang. Unknown number. A woman's voice spoke. "Is this David Porter?" He said it was. "This is Sarah Klein. I'm an attorney representing Catherine Brooks. She'd like to meet with you." David sat down on the edge of his bed. "I don't think that's a good idea." The attorney continued as if he had not spoken. "Ms. Brooks is aware that you were suspended from your position at Regional Medical. She's also aware that you may have saved her life. She'd like to discuss this with you in person. Today, if possible." David looked at Emma coloring at the kitchen table. Her movements were slow, tired. The heart condition was getting worse. "I can't. I need to stay with my daughter." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Bring her. Ms. Brooks suggested meeting at Monroe Park at 2 this afternoon. It's a public place, informal." David wanted to refuse, but something in him was curious. He agreed and ended the call. At 2 o'clock, he and Emma sat on a park bench near the fountain. Emma fed breadcrumbs to the pigeons, while David watched the path. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and a woman stepped out. She moved carefully, favoring her left side. Her dark hair was pulled back, and a faint bruise still marked her temple. But she was unmistakably the woman he had seen on the gurney 4 nights ago. Catherine Brooks walked over and sat down on the bench beside him. She did not offer her hand. She simply looked at him for a long moment. "You're the one who saved me." David shook his head. "Dr. Reed saved you. I just suggested a treatment." Catherine smiled slightly, though it did not reach her eyes. "Dr. Reed told me everything. He said you used to be a pharmacist here, that you lost your license for breaking protocol before, that you did it again to help me." David watched Emma chase a pigeon across the grass. "It wasn't about helping you specifically. It was about not being able to stand by and do nothing." Catherine leaned back against the bench, wincing slightly. "The hospital wants to bury this. They're calling it An experimental treatment administered under Dr. Reed's supervision. They don't want the liability of admitting a janitor performed an unauthorized medical intervention. David looked at her. Is that why you're here? To make sure I stay quiet. Catherine shook her head. I'm here because I wanted to meet the man who risked everything for a stranger. I've spent the last 10 years building a company, making deals, earning respect. And when I was dying, none of that mattered. The person who saved me was someone the system had thrown away. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She set it on the bench between them. There's $50,000 in there, for your daughter's medical expenses, and for whatever else you need. David stared at the envelope, but did not touch it. I didn't do it for money. Catherine's voice was quiet but firm. I know. That's exactly why I'm giving it to you. David stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. I don't want your charity. Catherine stood as well, her expression hardening. This isn't charity. It's payment for a debt. You gave me my life back. The least I can do is help you take care of yours. David called to Emma, who came running over. He took her hand and started walking toward the bus stop. Behind him, Catherine called out, You're the most stubborn man I've ever met. David did not turn around. And you're not the first person to tell me that. The envelope stayed on the park bench. David did not go back for it. 2 days later, Emma collapsed at school. The nurse called an ambulance. By the time David reached the emergency room, Emma was conscious again, but her lips had a blue tint that made his chest tighten. Dr. Yolanda Martinez, the pediatric cardiologist, met him in the hallway outside Emma's room. Her heart is failing, Mr. Porter. She needs surgery. Soon. We're talking about weeks, not months. David already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. How much? Dr. Martinez consulted her tablet. The surgery itself is around $200,000. With hospital stay, medications, and follow-up care, you're looking at closer to $300,000. Do you have insurance? David shook his head. He had lost his insurance when he lost his job. Dr. Martinez's expression softened. There are programs, payment plans. We can work with you. But we need to schedule the surgery as soon as possible. David sat down in the plastic chair outside Emma's room. $300,000. He made $12 an hour mopping floors. Even if he got his job back, he would never earn that kind of money. Not in time. He thought about the envelope on the park bench. $50,000. Not even a sixth of what he needed. Emma appeared in the doorway, an IV line trailing from her arm. She looked so small in the oversized hospital gown. Dad, I'm scared. David stood and wrapped his arms around her, careful not to disturb the IV. I know, baby. But you're going to be okay. I promise. Another promise he did not know how to keep. That night, after Emma fell asleep in the hospital bed, David sat in the chair beside her and called Rebecca. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. What do you want, David? Her voice was cold. It had been cold since the day she left. Emma needs heart surgery. It costs $300,000. I'm asking if you can help. Rebecca was silent for a moment. I have a new life now, David. A husband. A career. I can't keep bailing you out of the messes you create. David's grip tightened on the phone. This isn't about me. This is about our daughter. Rebecca's voice rose. Our daughter wouldn't be in this position if you hadn't thrown away your career for some misguided hero complex. You chose to play God, and you lost everything. That's on you, not me. The line went dead. David sat in the darkness and listened to the beep of Emma's heart monitor. Steady. For now. The next morning, Catherine Brooks walked into Emma's hospital room. David looked up in surprise. Catherine held the envelope in her hand. You left this. David stood, keeping his voice low so Emma would not wake. I told you I don't want it. Catherine glanced at Emma sleeping in the bed, then back at David. "I spoke with Dr. Martinez. I know how much the surgery costs. This won't cover everything, but it's a start. And I can help you raise the rest." David shook his head. "I don't need your pity." Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. "You think this is pity? I'm trying to save your daughter's life, the same way you saved mine." David moved toward the door, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I take your money, then what I did becomes a transaction. I didn't save you to get paid. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. If I accept this, it makes me just like everyone else who only does good when there's something in it for them." Catherine stared at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "So, you'd rather let your daughter die than accept help? What kind of father does that?" The words hit harder than anything Rebecca had ever said. David felt something crack inside him, but he kept his voice steady. "The kind who wants her to grow up knowing that integrity matters more than survival." Catherine stepped closer, her voice sharp. "Integrity doesn't keep her alive. Money does. Medicine does. Swallowing your pride does." David met her eyes. "Then, I guess I'm going to have to find another way." Catherine shook her head slowly, then set the envelope on the chair beside Emma's bed. "You're the most frustrating man I've ever met, but you're also the only person in the last 10 years who saw me as a human being instead of a checkbook." She turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back. "The offer stands. When you come to your senses, call me." She left. David stood alone in the room with his sleeping daughter and an envelope full of money he would not touch. Outside the window, the city moved on. Indifferent to the small battles being fought in hospital rooms across its expanse, Emma stirred and opened her eyes. "Who was that lady?" David sat on the edge of her bed and brushed the hair from her forehead. "Just someone I helped once." Emma smiled sleepily. "You help a lot of people, Dad." David kissed her forehead. "Not enough, sweetheart. Not enough." That night, Emma's condition worsened. Her oxygen levels dropped. The nurses rushed in. Dr. Martinez ordered additional monitoring. David stood against the wall and watched the flurry of activity, feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. When the crisis passed and Emma stabilized again, Dr. Martinez pulled him into the hallway. "We need to do the surgery within the next 72 hours. If we wait any longer, her heart may not be strong enough to survive the operation." David nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Martinez placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll talk to the billing department. We'll figure something out." But David knew there was nothing to figure out. The hospital could offer payment plans, but they could not perform a $300,000 surgery for free, not without some guarantee of payment. He returned to Emma's room and sat in the chair beside her bed. The envelope still lay where Catherine had left it. David stared at it for a long time. $50,000. Enough to start the process. Enough to show the hospital he was serious. But if he took it, he would be admitting that his principles were negotiable. That everything he had sacrificed 5 years ago meant nothing if he could be bought now. Emma's small voice broke the silence. "Dad, am I going to die?" David looked at his daughter's face, so pale and fragile in the dim light. He thought about all the speeches he had given himself about doing the right thing, about integrity, about not compromising, and he realized that all of it was meaningless if it cost him his daughter. He picked up the envelope. David opened the envelope. Inside were 5 stacks of $100 bills, bound with paper bands. He had never held this much cash in his life. It felt heavier than it should. He closed the envelope and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he picked up his phone and dialed the number Catherine had given him. She answered on the second ring. "I knew you'd call." David looked at Emma sleeping in the hospital bed. "I need your help. Not just the money. All of it. Whatever it takes to get her the surgery. Catherine's voice was calm, businesslike. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." She arrived in 15. This time she wore jeans and a sweater instead of business clothes, but she carried herself with the same unshakable confidence. She sat in the chair across from David and listened as he explained Emma's condition, the timeline, the cost. When he finished, Catherine pulled out her phone and made a call. David could only hear her side of the conversation. "This is Catherine Brooks. I need to speak with Director Sullivan at Regional Medical. Yes, I'll hold." She waited, her eyes never leaving Emma's sleeping form. Then someone came on the line. "Director Sullivan, this is Catherine Brooks. You treated me last week after my accident. I'm calling because I want to make a donation to your hospital. $500,000, but there's a condition." She listened for a moment. "I want you to perform heart surgery on a patient named Emma Porter, immediately. The donation covers her surgery, hospital stay, medications, and all follow-up care. Any remaining funds go to your pediatric cardiac unit." Another silence. "I'll have my attorney send over the paperwork within the hour. The money will be in your account by end of business today. But the surgery happens tomorrow morning. Do we have an agreement?" Catherine ended the call and looked at David. "It's done." David stared at her, unable to speak. Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. "When I was on that gurney, I thought about all the things I'd accomplished, the company I built, the deals I closed, the respect I earned. And I realized none of it mattered, because when you're dying, the only thing that matters is whether anyone cares enough to try to save you." She turned back to face him. "You cared, even though you didn't know me, even though it cost you everything. That's worth more than any business deal I've ever made." David found his voice. "I don't know how to thank you." Catherine shook her head. "You already did, the night you walked into that trauma bay." She left without another word. David sat beside Emma's bed and watched her breathe. For the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to believe that things might actually be okay. The next morning, the surgical team prepped Emma for surgery. She was scared, gripping David's hand so tightly his fingers went numb. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You're the bravest person I know. Sweetheart, I'll be right here when you wake up." Emma looked up at him with wide eyes. "Promise?" David smiled. "Promise." They wheeled her away. David stood in the empty hallway and watched the doors swing shut behind her. Then he walked to the waiting room and sat in a plastic chair that was identical to every other waiting room chair he had ever sat in. 4 hours later, Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway. Her surgical mask hung around her neck, and her scrubs were wrinkled, but she was smiling. The surgery was successful. Emma's heart is strong. She's going to be fine. David buried his face in his hands and wept. Emma spent 3 days in the ICU before moving to a regular room. David never left her side. He slept in the chair beside her bed and ate whatever the nurses brought him from the cafeteria. Catherine visited every afternoon, bringing books and puzzles for Emma and coffee for David. On the 4th day, Emma was well enough to sit up and color. Catherine sat beside her bed and helped her fill in a drawing of a butterfly. David watched from the doorway, struck by how natural it looked, like Catherine had been part of their lives for years instead of days. "Your dad tells me you're really good at math," Catherine said to Emma. Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I like fractions. They're like puzzles." Catherine smiled. "I like puzzles too. That's basically what running a company is. One big puzzle." Emma looked up at her. "Are you rich?" David started to intervene, but Catherine laughed. "I do okay." Emma considered this. "My dad says money doesn't matter as much as being a good person." Catherine glanced at David, then back at Emma. "Your dad is right, but sometimes money helps good people do good things." Emma accepted this and returned to her coloring. Catherine stood and walked over to David in the doorway. "Can we talk? Outside?" They stepped into the hallway. Catherine leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. "I've been thinking about what comes next. For you, I mean." David waited. Catherine continued. "You're a talented pharmacist. You have knowledge most people spent years acquiring. But you can't use it because of what happened 5 years ago." David nodded. "That's how it works. You break the rules, you pay the price." Catherine shook her head. "The rules are supposed to protect people, but sometimes they punish the wrong ones. What if there was a way to get your license reinstated?" David had stopped letting himself think about that possibility years ago. It doesn't work that way. Once you're revoked, you're done. Catherine smiled. "I know some people on the state pharmacy board, and I know how to make a compelling case, especially when that case involves a man who saved a life at great personal risk. Twice." David felt something stir in his chest. Something dangerous. Hope. "Why would you do that?" Catherine looked back toward Emma's room. "Because good people deserve second chances, and because I think you have a lot more lives to save." 6 months later, David stood behind the counter of a small pharmacy in a neighborhood where most people paid in cash and many did not speak English as their first language. The shop was narrow, wedged between a laundromat and a corner market, but it was his. The State Pharmacy Board had reviewed his case. Catherine's testimony, combined with Dr. Reed's reluctant acknowledgement that David's intervention had saved a patient's life, convinced them to grant him a provisional license. He would be on probation for 2 years, but he could practice again. Catherine had provided the funding to lease the space and stock the initial inventory. David had tried to refuse, but she had made it clear this was an investment, not charity. She expected to be repaid, with interest. Emma sat at a small table in the corner doing her homework. Her color had returned. She laughed more. The scar on her chest was already fading. The bell above the door chimed. Catherine walked in carrying a paper bag. "I brought lunch." "I hope you like Thai food." David smiled. "I like anything I don't have to cook." They sat at the table with Emma and ate pad Thai from takeout containers. Emma told Catherine about her science project. Catherine listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering suggestions. David watched them and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Contentment. After lunch, Catherine helped Emma clean up while David returned to the counter. An elderly woman came in with a prescription. She spoke limited English, but David had learned enough Spanish over the years to communicate. He filled her prescription, then spent 10 minutes explaining how to take the medication and what side effects to watch for. She tried to pay, but when she opened her purse, David could see it was nearly empty. "No charge today, Mrs. Alvarez." "Consider it a welcome gift." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hand and left. Catherine watched from across the shop. "You know you can't stay in business if you give away free medications." David smiled. "I'll figure it out." Catherine walked over and stood beside him at the counter. "You already have. That's why people keep coming back." The afternoon passed in a steady stream of customers. Prescriptions filled, questions answered, advice given. David moved through it all with a sense of purpose he had forgotten existed. This was what he was meant to do, not because it made him important or wealthy or respected, but because it allowed him to help people who needed help. At closing time, Catherine and Emma were still there. Emma had fallen asleep on the table, her head resting on her folded arms. Catherine carefully lifted her and carried her to the car David had managed to buy with his first month's earnings. It was 15 years old, and the air conditioning did not work, but it ran. David locked the pharmacy door and stood on the sidewalk looking at the small storefront. 6 months ago, he had been scrubbing floors and counting pills for a daughter he thought he might lose. Now he had a pharmacy, a provisional license, and a future that felt possible again. Catherine stood beside him, Emma sleeping in her arms. "You did good, David." David looked at her. "We did good. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Catherine shifted Emma's weight and smiled. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not supposed to do it alone." David drove them home to the apartment he and Emma had moved into last month. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that was not also a living room, and windows that actually opened. Catherine helped him carry Emma inside and tuck her into bed. Then they stood in the small kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about nothing important. When Catherine finally left, David sat on the couch and looked around the quiet apartment. Emma's drawings covered the refrigerator. Her backpack hung by the door. Her laughter still echoed in the walls. He thought about the night he had stood in a hospital hallway, holding a paper cup of herbs, knowing that what he was about to do could cost him everything. He had been terrified, but he had done it anyway, because sometimes the right thing and the safe thing are not the same. And sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. David picked up his phone and looked at the photo he had saved. Emma at 8 years old, smiling with her front teeth missing. The same photo that used to hang in his locker at the hospital, but now there was a new photo beside it. Emma at 9 years old, healthy and strong, standing in front of the pharmacy on opening day. He set the phone down and closed his eyes. Miracles were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were quiet. Sometimes they came in the form of a stranger who refused to give up. Sometimes they looked like a man who had spent 5 years mopping floors, finally remembering who he used to be. And sometimes the person you save ends up saving you right back.